Hey, hello everyone and welcome. I know you all are still coming in after we have opened up our webinar for today, and we will get started in just a moment. Just wanted to welcome you and to see if we have anybody else who comes in before we formally begin. Okay. Well, hello once again, and welcome to today's webinar on collaborating for justice for older African Americans. This is the second part of a three-part webinar series that we are offering to share more about the importance of engaging culturally specific programs and organizations in multidisciplinary elder justice responses. So here at NCAL, the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, we recently released a new resource to support mainstream organizations and elder justice teams. That guide is called Collaborating for Justice. And in this webinar series, we'll cover more about the resource and how it can support your work to ultimately improve the safety and lives of African American older adults. Today's webinar will focus specifically on the guiding principles and essential elements of equitable partnerships and collaboration. This project was, oops, sorry about that. We want to thank our partners at the United States Department of Justice, the Office for Victims of Crime, for funding that made this project possible today. And we'd like to note that the content of this webinar is that of the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, also known as NCAL, and not necessarily the Department of Justice. And now we'll take some time to introduce ourselves as presenters. I will first kick it off to Kristen.
Thanks, Victoria. Hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Berkey. I'm the director of NCAL, the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. And I'll be presenting today with Victoria.
Thank you so much. And once again, I'm Victoria Ferguson Young. I'm the Victim Services Coordinator at the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. And I will be one of your co-presenters on today. I also want to introduce our ASL, or American Sign Language interpreters, Jennifer Jacobs and Janet Serpa. So they will be interpreting for us today. So also we want to invite each of you to use the chat for comments and to use the question and answer box, if you will, for for your questions and answers. Well, we will have some that will take place today. So we will not be using the speaking option. We'll just be using the chat and Q&A features. So let me tell you a little bit more about NCAL. I've said our name a few times, but we are the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. We are a part of End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin. So we're a national project and initiative of End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin. We provide support to communities and professionals across the country to improve services to older adults impacted by abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and especially surrounding abuse in later life. This includes training, providing consultation and technical assistance, as well as developing resources such as the Collaborating for Justice project and guide. But we wholeheartedly believe that all of us deserve to age with safety and with dignity, and that it makes our community stronger and safer, and it takes all of us working together to do so. So let's do a little bit of a recap from our webinar from last week. So last week, we provided an introduction to the Collaborating for Justice Guide project, as well as the Increasing Access to Healing Services and Just Outcomes for Older African American Crime Survivors Toolkits. I know that's a mouthful, but our primary focus for today is on the Collaborating for Justice project. And last week, we focus on that as well. We heard from Dr. Latrice Buck, who shared the history of the Increasing Access Toolkit and its purpose of serving as a guide for service provision for older African American survivors. We also spent time talking in depth about the purpose, the role, and importance of culturally specific organizations in the African American community, and also in advancing elder justice. We discussed the fact that these organizations are created by, for, and led by the people of the African American community and American communities to provide culturally grounded and healing services. We thoroughly discussed the impact of historical and present day trauma, which underscores the importance of culturally competent and racially literate agencies and service providers. We concluded last week's webinar with some homework for each of you to identify, to learn about, and to assess relationships with the culturally specific organizations in your community. So again, to recap from last week, here's the definition spelled out once again for culturally specific programs and organizations. So these programs that are designed for, designed by, and led by the community that they intend to serve is what makes them unique and culturally specific. All or most of their clientele is from that particular community. So in this case, the African American community, and their services reflect the cultural values, norms, and expectations and attitudes of the group served. Additionally, these organizations and programs may focus on a variety of issues such as domestic and sexual violence, health equity, housing, mental health services, child care services. So oftentimes, culturally specific organizations don't solely focus on ending violence or abuse, but really serve a variety of needs that the community has. So some examples that we talked about in the real world are the Asha Project of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Affinity Community Services in Chicago, Illinois, the Sasha Center in Detroit, Michigan, and Our House in Greenville, Mississippi. So let's talk a bit more about the elements of these programs. So while the African American community is not a monolith and there is tremendous diversity of experiences and perspectives within it, there's also a shared historical and cultural context that makes these programs unique. And that's due to historical and present day racialized oppression occurring at the organizational, institutional, and structural level that's not adequately accounted for normally in traditional service provision approaches. And that's really the reason behind why so many culturally specific organizations were created to really meet those particular needs. So these organizations are rooted in being community driven, racially and culturally literate, culturally grounded. They provide peer support. They often provide a holistic view of well-being, meaning that they're more than just being victim centered. They're often family centered in their approach to service provision. And they are community based versus being criminal justice based. So very important that community is centralized and there's often not as much partnership or interaction with the criminal justice system. So I'll turn things over to Kristen for our next part.
Thanks, Victoria. So we'll just continue to recap briefly before we get into some new content today, and I'll be sharing a little bit about what is the Collaborating for Justice Guide. So for easy access, the Collaborating for Justice Guide can be accessed through this QR code here, and then we'll put a link to that in the chat as well. So we developed this guide really to help professionals who are working with older adults build stronger and more equitable collaborations with the African American community and then with culturally specific programs. So this project really builds on the understanding of the importance of the historical, political, and cultural context in how elder justice partners serve older African American survivors. One of the reasons this came about is that we work with coordination teams like CCRs or multidisciplinary teams across the country. And one of the common things that we heard is that these teams struggle with having the team reflect the makeup of the community. Oftentimes, a lot of people said, really the teams are a lot of people who are white, and they really struggle to adequately reflect the racial makeup of the community and the African American community in particular. So with this project, we really wanted to learn, why is that? What's the perspective of elder justice mainstream partners? What's the perspective of culturally specific programs? What are the barriers to collaboration? And then really, what would effective collaboration look like? What really would it take? And this is so important because elder abuse is complex, and it really takes multidisciplinary responses. So to have a key partner missing from the table will really limit the effectiveness of the group. So there are three components to the Collaborating for Justice project that I'll briefly go over. Our team developed this guide really through holding several interviews, roundtable discussions, and listening sessions with culturally specific and mainstream organizations. We asked them about what's the impact of culturally specific programs? What is the current status of collaboration? What are barriers? If there's equitable collaboration, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And so through what we learned, we developed this guide with these three components. The first of which is the report. This covers why are culturally specific programs important, and then it translates themes that we learned from the interviews and listening sessions into 8 guiding principles for equitable collaboration. We're going to focus a lot of our time today at today's webinar on those 8 guiding principles. And then within those guiding principles, what are action steps? Really, what are tangible strategies that can be used? So ultimately, we wanted this to be very practical. We wanted you to walk away taking the reading this, coming back away from this webinar, having ideas that you can really add to your to-do list that will help you build more meaningful partnerships. The second component of the Collaborating for Justice is the conversation guide. We know that before elder justice teams seek to build relationships with culturally specific programs, it's important they develop a common understanding of why this is important and how they're going to go about it. So the conversation guide helps a team lead, facilitate this conversation within their group. So we'll discuss a little bit more about the conversation guide in today's webinar. And then the third component is the community forum toolkit. We heard during our listening sessions that one of the barriers to collaboration is that many community partners are working in silos, and there's a lot of reasons for that, whether it's funding limitations, time, turnover, et cetera. So what that means, though, is that a lot of times partners don't know what's happening in their own community to support the African American community. So to address this, the Community Forum toolkit equips multidisciplinary teams with resources to bring together people who are working with older adults in the African American community, really to better understand what are the community efforts happening, what's already occurring, and then what are opportunities to advance elder justice further. So for those of you who attended last week, we asked you to do a little bit of homework. We asked you to do 2 things. One was to first research in your own area. What are some culturally specific programs? What are agencies that are serving your community, or even things, programs that you learned about that were national? And then we asked you to review the the Collaborating for Justice guide. And so we'd like to hear just briefly in the chat, if you could first respond to the first set of questions. Were you able to find any culturally specific programs? What was the process like as you tried to find them? So go ahead and enter those in the chat. All right, well, as you're entering, or you're giving that some thought, one of the things that we really talked about last week was the importance of really thinking both within and beyond elder justice teams or elder justice programs. So oftentimes when we were looking for culturally specific programs, we were looking for African American programs that served older adults experiencing elder abuse. And what we found was that that was really challenging. We weren't able to find a lot of programs that had that overlap. But when we started to broaden our kind of thinking about what are culturally specific programs that perhaps serve people across the lifespan, and just by the nature of doing that, they are serving elder abuse victims, it really helped us to widen our lens and find a lot more programs that were maybe focused on health equity or on housing or on HIV, AIDS, or family services. There were a lot of the one that Victoria mentioned, Affinity in Chicago, is focused on serving the LGBTQ plus African American community in Chicago. So that really, and they're doing a lot of work with older adults, and by the nature of that, will be experiencing work with people who experience abuse. Any thoughts on the second question for you to enter in the chat about, as you were reviewing the Collaborating for Justice guide, were there any insights or reactions or feedback that you had upon kind of reviewing the guide? I see Maya's response in the chat about culturally specific programs in her area. They've broader areas of focus and serve more than one culturally specific population. Right. Okay. All right. Well, feel free to keep entering your thoughts in the chat as we keep going on. We'll keep an eye on it. All right. So now that we've done a bit of recap, just to make sure we're all on the same page about what's the foundation of this work, let's talk about what we'd like you to learn from today's webinar. So our hope is that you'll really have a strong understanding of why equitable collaboration with culturally specific programs is important. We'd like you to know more about the challenges that African American culturally specific programs face in engaging with multidisciplinary teams. And then we'd also want you to learn about how the guiding principles for building effective partnerships can practically support your work in building meaningful relationships with these types of programs. So Victoria's going to kick us off, with the next section.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And as Kristen said, please continue to think about those questions from our webinar last week as well. And so now we're going to shift into talking a bit more about equitable partnerships and collaboration. Since we've discussed the purpose and importance and impact of culturally specific organizations last week, and we just did a recap, we're going to shift to learning more about establishing, sustaining, and hopefully that you better understand what makes partnerships equitable and collaborations equitable with culturally specific organizations. So why collaborate? Why is this so important? Because it's important because older adults live complex lives and in complicated situations. And older African American adults have experienced racialized trauma that really must be considered in the care and services provided to them. And no one discipline or no one agency has all of the answers or can do everything on their own. So us working together to pool resources and to help one another out and to really provide more options to services is very critically important. So when we collaborate, we can work together to find the best solutions for our victims. We're able to better identify barriers that older adult victims may face when they're seeking healing services and just outcomes. So we see a quote here by Terry Tempest Williams, who is an American writer and educator, that says, "Imagination shared create collaboration, collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change." So when we work together, that is truly the foundation of being able to achieve the change that we want to see. Whoops. So the power of collaboration. Hope that that quote gives you just a bit more insight to what makes collaboration more powerful. But to continue on in that vein, meaningful collaborations are equitable collaborations. So you see a quote here that speaks to meaningful collaborations, and as mainstream community coordination teams and service providers, and those of you from elder justice teams, establishing meaningful and equitable collaborations with African American culturally specific organizations, it leads to producing useful tools, it leads to minimizing tokenism and the replication of institutional oppression. When an equitable partnership has been established, an environment that contributes to shared power and racial equity is present. So where there is feelings and inequality and policies of equity there, it truly just breeds such shared power in a way that only manifests to help those that we're serving. So meaningful collaborations and also deepen understanding amongst groups and organizations, which allows for more meaningful work to take place. So I want you to keep that in mind as well. And for part two, additionally, and most importantly, victim safety can be positively impacted and improved when we're working together and when we're collaborating. Collaborations achieve a more complete picture of a victim's needs because population specific organizations can highlight the unique needs of their community, ensuring that more agencies are intentional about assisting and addressing those needs. So when you have at a task force or elder justice team or coordinated community response team meeting, where you have voices from population specific areas or culturally specific areas or organizations, you learn more about the needs of that population and how we can all better work together to serve those needs. So collaborations also allow for more options for survivors because of the increased awareness of victim safety and healing programs. Because, for example, more referrals can take place and recommendations to victims seeking specific services. So, when you know more and you know more about the services available, you can refer and um, get more victims to utilize those services. Also, collaborations provide opportunities for organizations to share resources. And I don't just mean money, it's not always money. It can be connections and information, which can reduce the duplication of services and strengthen what's already existing. When we think about collaboration in response to elder abuse and abuse in later life, it becomes even more important due to the complexities of these particular cases. Many older adult victims may be living with a mobility challenge or difficulty, and may have additional health needs, and they may be in need of intervention for financial abuse, which is very common in elder abuse, which and all of those can require additional services than most victim service providers normally have. So when there are solid partnerships and collaborations in place, the effect of assisting an older adult in achieving safety and justice and healing is considerably improved. Additionally, it's important to note that collaboration does not have to be formal. It does not necessarily mean that there has to be a task force or a council in place or a grant between agencies. It can mean that, but doesn't have to. Informal partnerships can be incredibly effective. Taking the time to learn more about one another, to learn more about one another's services can be very effective as in an informal partnership, with ultimately can just help to provide additional safety and additional resources for those victims in need. And as we talk about who's collaborating, so we talked a bit about various teams. Let's discuss some of these formal community collaboration and coordination teams who are often involved in elder abuse, addressing elder abuse, and in elder justice. So these teams, they may vary by community. Your communities may have some by these names. You may have additional teams or um, or groups that come together. But so these teams can vary, but they are typically focused on macro level system change for victim safety. So not those who are really necessarily discussing particular cases, but who are working on macro level change. So some of those teams could be coordinated community response teams. They could also be multidisciplinary teams or enhanced multidisciplinary teams. And they have a focus on, they typically have a focus on elder abuse and abuse in later life. This also includes fatality review teams and financial abuse specialist teams, which are also known as FAST. So these are just some examples of the elder justice community coordination teams that we are referring to. And what agencies go to the next slide. What agencies make up these teams? Who are the partners that are part of these teams? So you see here on this slide, we have several different disciplines that are represented because membership should include all agencies that have a significant contact with the victim of abuse in later life. So we want you to consider for your community coordination team, clergy, healthcare providers, victim service organizations, of course, aging services networks, social service agencies. All of these various types of partners should be involved. And of course, your culturally specific organizations. There's no one organization or system that can fully address the complexity of abuse in later life. So we all really have to work together to make that happen. So be strategic about who you invite from each agency. A frontline worker can provide insight from day-to-day operations, while a director can give you a better big picture perspective as well. So all experiences are really valuable in these efforts. So when we're engaging those who are most impacted, for older victims from traditionally marginalized or underserved groups that have been systemically denied access to economic or political opportunity um, through systemic, I'm sorry, who have been denied access to economic and political opportunity through discrimination or cultural or structural bias, system responses, and mainstream organizations. Sometimes these larger groups may not feel helpful or supportive, and those older adults can often be left without effective support. So when we think about these coordinated community response teams, we definitely want to make sure that the most marginalized and vulnerable groups, like the African American community, are represented well. But when you engage culturally specific programs that are trusted and a part of the community, these elder justice teams become more comprehensive and relevant for the whole community. So we want to really drive home the point that these culturally specific organizations are key partners in this work that must be valued, that must be engaged, that must be a part of the work to improve services for older African American adults. And what are some of the barriers that get in the way of equitable collaboration? Why don't we see more of it happening? So for mainstream organizations and community coordination teams, um, there is a varied level of awareness of culturally specific programs. Sometimes because there's a different approach, because there's a more holistic approach, they may be seen as there may be misunderstandings and how it or thoughts that you can't work together well because of a difference in approach. But again, we have to recognize how important it is to have these organizations at the table. There may also be a lack of knowledge of effective relationship building and collaboration strategies from mainstream organizations or teams. Maybe because oftentimes we find that resources are concentrated, especially monetary resources may be concentrated in more mainstream organizations. There may have been a thought that maybe the need to collaborate hasn't been as prevalent. So wanting to, just again to speak to some of the barriers that could be in place. Some organizations may not be aware of grassroots projects aimed at addressing the African American community priorities. So, which is why we wanted you with our homework to reach out and to seek to um, find and learn more about culturally specific organizations in your community, because we want you to be aware of the work that they're doing. Um, And then also, if mainstream organizations are aware of culturally specific ones, they may lack a clear understanding of the mission, approach, interests, and priorities. So again, the importance of working together and of learning more about the services provided by culturally specific organizations helps to alleviate and to start to break down these barriers and increase understanding amongst agencies and amongst entities. So let's reflect on partnerships for a moment. So we'd like you to take a moment and just think about partnerships that you've been a part of in your work. What's made them successful? What made that possible? And also to think about a time where you struggled to form an effective partnership. Why was that? So how about just take a moment and just think about that on your own, and if you have something that you'd like to share in the chat, or please do so. Just want to kind of gather and get some of your thoughts on what's made your partnership successful and what has made them struggle. What are some things that you've dealt with in your work? So keep this experience in mind as we move through the next section on principles of equitable collaboration and strategies. And closer to the end of today's session, we'll ask for strategies that you may try in your ongoing efforts to build equitable partnerships. So just keep that in mind. Let's see, do we have any? What's been said in the chat? Good communication, absolutely. Common goals, shared interests, that's so important. These are just some of the things, when you both have a vision, or when agencies have that common goal or shared vision for what they can achieve, that really helps to put things into perspective in a way. When you're able to recenter and refocus on that common goal or interest, it can really help to move things along in partnerships. And I see Donna says successful partnerships usually happen when we have shared goals and we can see clearly how we can help each other. She struggled when trying to work with an organization that is understaffed with other priorities. Yes, great point. Great point. Thank you for that. And so we want you to continue to think about your successes and about challenges and difficulties as I pass things over to Kristen for our next section.
Thanks, Victoria. All right, so we've talked about the importance of culturally specific programs in serving the African American community, and then we've talked about elder justice community coordination. So next, we're going to connect the dots a bit. So in this next section, we'll talk about how do we ensure that elder justice teams are inclusive of culturally specific programs, and what does this effective partnership really look like? So this is a summary slide, the guiding principles of equitable collaboration. And we'll be discussing in depth in subsequent slides each of the guiding principles. So in the conversations with culturally specific and mainstream providers that we had for this project, we heard common themes about what does it take to build a partnership that really feels equitable. What can mainstream organizations do? What can elder justice teams do to build relationships that will ultimately make older African American adults safer and really ultimately have greater access to the support services that they need? So the first guiding principle is to incorporate an understanding of the historical and present day impact of racism. A lot of this context of historical and present day racism we discussed in depth last week at the webinar. So elder justice coalitions that really want to partner with African American culturally specific programs must first understand the factors that may be resulting in marginalization of the African American community, and ways that they can intentionally undo that marginalization. There were some great comments in last week's webinar about how it's very important to know more and to learn more about how that looks in your specific community. Understanding that racism exists and is very real is a good step, but really understanding how does that play a role in your specific community is an even more relevant step. For example, in your specific community, there may have been a recent incident of racialized police violence that specifically undermines trust between the African American community and law enforcement. Or you might know that there's a funder in your community who routinely funds mainstream organizations versus funding culturally specific organizations, and that this really undermines the ability of the culturally specific program to grow. So what does it look like? What steps can you take to incorporate an understanding of racism? There are a few strategies listed on this slide. So one is really deepen your knowledge of the history of race and racism. Educate yourself on the African-American experience in the US and in your local community. You can go about this by attending training, building training into your organization's budget. Develop racial literacy. So develop language and awareness to have effective conversations about race and racism's impact on your community and your work. And then to also do the internal work, reflect on your own relationship with race, power, and privilege, and how that plays out in yourself and in your organization. So Victoria mentioned this, but I do, as we go through these 8 strategies and the action steps, we want you to think about the relationships that you have in your community and what you could, which one of these strategies feels feasible to you, which ones that we're talking about resonate with you and are like, oh, I could do that, or oh, that seems pretty like a pretty good first step, because we'd like to kind of gather that feedback from you once we go through these strategies. So the second guiding principle is to build a holistic network of partners. So the issue of elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation is complex. Older adults impacted by it often have varied support systems, which may include non-traditional sources. Some communities have culturally specific African-American programs or initiatives. And for those that do, very few, as we've talked about, have elder abuse specifically as their mission. But many of these programs serve people across the lifespan. So whether their mission is focused on health or mental health, housing, or other issues. So building collaborations with these organizations really can assist the Elder Justice Collaborative to reach, identify, and serve older African Americans in their community that they otherwise might not be able to. So again, thinking beyond typical elder justice partners. So how might you go about building a holistic network? One is be part of activities and events in the African American community, even if they're not elder justice specific. Identify intersections in your community. So what entities or initiatives are being led by the African American community that serve older adults, even if older adults aren't their primary population? For example, the faith community, mental health services, housing programs, substance use programs. Engage faith leaders within the African American community, attend community forums at places of worship, or ask to speak to participants. And then attend or host community meetings to learn about the work being done. So the third guiding principle is to build trust with culturally specific programs by being trustworthy. So many culturally specific programs describe distrust with mainstream entities because of experiences they've had that have undermined or even exploited the culturally specific program. So mainstream entities must really intentionally and be slow and thoughtful in combating marginalization. And they must act in ways that demonstrate trustworthiness. So it's just simply not enough to invite the program to the collaborative meetings or to say that all are welcome to attend the meetings. Really, elder justice partners must be willing to show they're trustworthy before expecting to be trusted. So what are ways to show that you're trustworthy? One is to speak out in public and in private against racism when it occurs in the community and within other system settings. Be vocal. Another is to recognize achievements and accomplishments in the African American community. Support the priorities and work of the program and the community, even if they're different from your priorities. And then to follow through and integrate learning, follow up with words and actions, be willing to change your practices. In one of the the listening sessions we did, one of the culturally specific program leaders really talked a lot about this. She said that, people attend meetings or they have conversations and people say, oh, we really want to work with you. We really support your work. Or maybe they'll do a training and people are very responsive during the training, but afterward, really no change happens. Nothing, none of the suggestions made by the African-American leader or program are really enacted. And so that really undermines trust. Another is be willing to address difficult issues, deal with conflicts directly versus prioritizing harmony. And then don't forget, of course, the basics of relationship building. So invest time, be authentic, and show you're dependable. So guiding principle 4, this is to recognize that relationships are everything. So many partners addressing elder justice find themselves working in silos for many reasons. There's the demands of the organization, funding requirements, competition for funding, staffing capacities, lack of adequate resources, lots of different reasons. But effective collaboration really requires relationships that are authentic, and that really requires time. Trust and relationships are built over time. So this is particularly the case with culturally specific organizations serving the African-American community as a result of the historical marginalization of this community and programs serving it, as well as current practices that continue to marginalize these programs. So what are some practical steps to cultivate relationships? Well, one is don't wait for the culturally specific program to come to your spaces and events. It's important to go to the community in the spaces meant for the population you're serving. So if there's a community event or a cultural event, go attend those. In addition to community events, the culturally specific program might have events such as an outreach event or a fundraising event. Attending really shows your interest in getting to know the program, the people, and then the network of that program. And then think expansively about who you might have connections with. So perhaps there's an African-American leader in the community who has a personal connection to elder justice, or maybe they have an interest in the issue. Even if they're not embedded in an elder justice organization, they may have shared interests and maybe connections that would be make them a really influential champion of the work. So I'll pass it to Victoria to talk about the second half of the guiding principles.
Thank you so much, Kristen. As for me, thank you so much for that. I've my connection lost for a moment. So for principle number 5, value the culturally specific program's expertise. By design, African American culturally specific programs are part of the community and have the understanding needed to develop solutions that will be effective for that community. So while elder justice collaborations outwardly communicate, of course, that all are welcome and that we serve everyone, some culturally specific programs don't feel welcome in these spaces or may even feel undervalued in the community. So African American community leaders may experience partners from mainstream organizations that do not trust their credibility or see their value. Additionally, there's often an emphasis on academic credibility over community credibility in this work. So best practices in service provision may stem from academics, which are more highly prioritized or highly valued, over best practices stemming from the experience of working with or working directly within a community. So valuing a culturally specific program expertise is such an important value. Next slide, please. So some of the strategies to demonstrate this value are first to recognize and uplift what's already happening. Ask a culturally specific program in your community, what are they doing and what can be done to add to this? Learn more about their programming and why it's happening and what need it's serving in particular. And your communication and engagement, acknowledge and honor and respect what these agencies are already doing. and ask how the elder justice team you may be a part of can support that work that a culturally specific program is doing. Can you show up and attend one of their events or support their programming in some way? Also, make referrals to the culturally specific organizations in your community. If you have clients, African American clients, and you know about an agency, a culturally specific agency in your community, make sure that they know about their services too. Make sure that they're aware of their services in case they are, it is an agency that they want to engage. Also, respect service models that are different from the mainstream or approach work differently. So we touched on that a bit before. So that's an important piece here too, and recognize and uplift. So continue to do that. Have opportunities for a culturally specific program to share their work and let people know of their experiences. Lift up their successes. So in your team meetings, in your gatherings, be sure to amplify the voices and the work and the experiences and the programming of these agencies, because we typically don't get that same attention or that same recognition. Next slide, please. So number 6, share power and resources. So uneven power dynamics can really wreak havoc in teams. And they may result in some partners not feeling comfortable speaking up or others prioritizing smooth relationships over progress. So power dynamics are often underscored by funding levels, who's getting the money of the participating organizations in most or many communities. Also, partners are eligible for the same limited funding. So there's often maybe a spirit of competitiveness, or there's scarce resources, and that can really just be a barrier to more effective partnership. And this can also, oops, let me go back, create a competition where an organization is focused on securing their own funding to serve their clients versus working together. So keeping that in mind too. In these cases, organizations with less funding may not be as direct with what they see is needed for fear that they may lose their funding opportunity. In other cases, an organization that is satisfied with their funding may not be fully engaged because they already know that they have the funding needed. Either scenario or either situation undermines collaboration and innovation. That really, and those who suffer the most are the victims and survivors that we're serving. So, what are some strategies to address this and to share power? So, first, involve culturally specific programs from the start in your initiative, your project, your collaboration, your team. Don't design a project and then later ask them to get involved once things have been designed. That feels tokenizing, but when you can bring people in from the start, or work together from the start and to brainstorm together on an initiative or a grant or funding you can work off together, that feels much more like a partnership. When writing new grants, bring a smaller program to the table at the concept phase. So when you're first thinking about it, versus getting a letter of support or MOU after a grant has been written or has been awarded. Um, so let's avoid that. Develop a partnership framework surrounding leadership roles and responsibilities, and embrace conflict as healthy, and don't attribute conflict so much to personalities. Conflict is really an opportunity to grow, right? It's an opportunity to learn more, or to lean in and to find out more about one another, so that you can really again work and achieve your shared goal and your shared vision, or responsibility. And publicly give credit to the smaller organizations when the partnership shares an accomplishment. So being intentional about these efforts to share power and to share resources, share connections. If you know a leader in the city who's been helpful, and maybe your organization or your team achieving something or getting some recognition or making an initiative happen, share that resource, and invite a smaller organization, a culturally specific organization, to the table to meet with that person too. Things like that really can just amplify and magnify the impact of this work. So develop a partnership framework, leadership roles and resources, develop your agreements within the team around the decision-making process, who will be involved and how will different perspectives be managed, and consider a framework that recognizes all partners. So regardless of size or funding, seeking to have equity at the table, that everyone has equal power. And of course, identifying shared goals and interests from the beginning really helps with sharing power and resources, because you're always focus on what the goal is to achieve, versus what you're each trying to get individually. Number seven, invest in culturally specific programs. So support the capacity of culturally specific programs through sharing connections, funding, and other investments. The marginalization of the African American community not only impacts older adults impacted by abuse, but it also impacts these programs and organizations that serve the African American community. So as a result, these programs tend to have fewer resources than mainstream programs, and they may therefore have smaller budgets or a smaller staff and just don't have the capacity or availability as a larger mainstream organization. So this often can impact a program's capacity to write for or manage large grants that would ultimately improve their capacity, but being able to get to that point is much more difficult. So it also can impact the time available to participate in the community collaboration. So and thinking of ways you can invest. A relatively small investment that can be huge is thinking about scheduling for your coordination team meetings. So if your meetings are always on a Friday and you notice that the members of culturally specific organizations aren't there or can't meet, that may be inconvenient for them. So thinking and maybe and reaching out and asking, what would work for you? Maybe it's a different time, maybe it's even a different place, because when there are smaller amount of resources and a smaller staff, it can be more difficult to leave for meetings that may be in the middle of the day or something of that nature. So checking in to find out can be a huge investment in making sure that these voices are at the table as well. So what are some additional strategies when partnering with small organizations that don't have large budgets or large staff? Ask what capacity building support would be helpful. Share the connections that you have, again, the policymakers, media, donors, people of that nature, disciplines of that nature, and review grant proposal budgets for equitable distribution of funds. Ensure that the budget covers indirect costs versus only salary. You also want to attend fundraisers of the culturally specific program, support their community events to show that you're really vested and interested in their work. Highlight the work of the program in the mainstream organizations, in your newsletters, in your social media or blog posts. Encourage your network to volunteer or to donate or to attend the events of these smaller organizations. Amplify the issues that are important to the African American community or culturally specific program. When there are instances in the news of a racial event that has taken place or hate crime or something of that nature, when a mainstream organization speaks to that or stands with or amplifies the voices of a culturally specific African American organization, that can build just trust and partnership, and also invest in increasing awareness of that organization and that issue. And offer to support with grant writing too. If that's something that your team or your agency is well versed in, has the capacity for, be sure to support those agencies in that way as well. Okay. Number 8, promote survivor-defined support, including alternatives to law enforcement. This aspect and this guiding principle is such a key factor for culturally specific organizations in the African American community, because for many survivors of elder abuse, engaging law enforcement is a last resort, especially if the person who is causing harm to the older adult is their family member or their adult child. In the African American community, which has been living with the legacy of of the criminal justice system's role in controlling and dehumanizing African Americans since the time of slavery all the way to the present day, it often brings about a feeling of lack of trust, and not of safety for African Americans to be engaged in a criminal justice system. So, despite the criminal legal system often being seen as a detriment to their safety, this system is typically the anchor of is an anchor for elder justice collaboration. So many elder justice teams, have law enforcement, have prosecutors, have judges, which are of course important, and they're core partners. But within this work and in thinking about older African Americans, centering the criminal justice system in that way and surrounding and then looking for strategies to improve services is often a barrier for African Americans to feel safe and to want to engage in that manner. So thinking about survivor defined support, listening to the needs and to the approaches of culturally specific organizations and leaders will be really beneficial in determining the best ways to serve the African American community. And so as we look at some strategies, so kind of piggybacking on what I said, ensure the voices of community-based partners are weighed as heavily as criminal legal system partners. So making sure that those who are at the table from culturally specific organizations are speaking as much, are valued as much as those from the legal system. Learn how community-based and culturally specific organizations are assisting older adults without engaging the criminal legal system. That can be a great place to even, conversation to have with leaders of culturally specific organizations. How are they really centralizing their community-based approaches? Have conversations with your elder justice team about the limitations of censoring the criminal legal system and how that impacts the African American community's access to services. Also, map out how an older survivor reaches services depending on which organization they contact first. So, thinking about what may be the path for a survivor, if they were to reach out here first, what would we recommend them to do, versus if it was a culturally specific agency. That can be really illuminating as well to just think of some additional strategies and ways to provide services. And then finally, discuss current and future options for building survivor-defined and community-based responses that only include the criminal legal system if that's something that survivor wants. So having some other options, knowing about some other options, other approaches, other ways to meet the needs to provide healing and just outcomes is such an important part of improving your services to older African American adults and even in working with culturally specific programs. Okay, so we've said a lot in these 8 discussion principles and hope that you have now feel a bit more informed about each of them and have a bit more information on each. And so we just have another discussion question that we invite you to utilize the chat for. And that is, which guiding principles are resonating with you? We asked a similar question last week about what's resonating with you, but which ones are really standing out to you? Is there one that's new you hadn't thought of, or one that you've been working on and really want to elaborate on in particular? So what's standing out to you? Which of them do you think you could take back and use in your community right away? What can you bring to your next meeting as something that you can do differently? So please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A, and we'll check them and can just share some of your responses. Which one of these principles are resonating? Well, let me say, I hope that, I think the bottom line, oh, I see we got a response from Lavicia Jeter. She says, share power and resources. Yep, that's such an important one that we heard a lot from in our listening sessions. Promoting, oh, we got several coming in now, valuing the culturally specific programs expertise, understanding the impact of racism, promoting alternatives to the legal and criminal system, and demonstrating trustworthiness. That feels very important. Awesome. And Jennifer says, I'm feeling really validated about cultural events we participate in, even when they're not elder focused. That's great. So yeah, these, there's no wrong answers here. We really want you to just think about which ones you can take and use right away. We worked really hard to make these principles very practical and something that you could easily use and bring back to your team and talk about and work on right away. So glad to hear that. Please, keep thinking about it and share with us. I see we got a few more reaching out to leaders in the community, learn more about what the organization's doing, amplifying their work, family alternatives rather than victim only, sharing grant writing resources. Awesome. So glad that these are resonating with you. All right, let's move on to our next slide, in which we are now going to get into the other components of the Collaborating for Justice guide. So we sent you the link. We hope you've had some time to look through it. And of course, you can do so at your leisure, but we really want to encourage you to do so sooner rather than later while this information is fresh for you. But now let's get into part two of the Collaborating for Justice toolkit, and that is the conversation guide. And so now that we've gone through these other points, we want to really take you into the guide so that you understand how to use it and what's in it. So the purpose, you see a little picture of this is what it looks like in the guide itself, with the cover pages. But it is to prepare mainstream organizations, elder justice teams, community coordination teams, all of these teams for the work of building equitable partnerships. So this guide was created to help all of you with these agencies and teams to discuss, plan, and build consensus internally. So first amongst yourselves, before engaging African American culturally specific organizations to work on establishing and building partnerships. This guide is designed to ask the questions needed to address any fears, hesitations, challenges, and concerns with beginning this important racial justice work. So, it's important to talk about this, amongst your team first, how you want to reach out, what guiding principles, should we maybe focus on initially as we reach out, what concerns do we have, or maybe we've tried this before and it didn't go well, so what should we do better, what can we do differently this time? So these, and also keep in mind that although we have created this guide to have the conversations really internally and with your team before doing outreach, they are designed to really be ongoing. So we love for you to start with them, but it's not once you've had a conversation, you put it away. We want you to continue to use it. So these conversations are never truly complete. So because addressing inequity and establishing new practices and collaboration, it takes time. It takes consistent dialogue. It takes practice. It takes trial and error. But the bottom line is that you keep at it. You're persistent. You're determined to establish some really great partnerships in your community. Okay, so for the focus. So the conversation guide specifically focuses on creating the space for courageous conversations. And we use the word courageous because we know that these types of conversations where we talk about race or addressing the African American community are oftentimes rare and may be avoided. So we wanted to create an additional support to help you get started. And this guide has 4 topics that it focuses on. So first, the importance of intentionally supporting older African American adults, exploring fears and concerns about equitable engagement, organizing the space to engage in difficult conversations about race, power, and collaboration. So again, these are not designed to just happen one time. We want you to refer back to this guide, use it again and again. Think about the questions as you start your outreach work, come back to it, check in with one another. And additionally, the conversation guide has a lot of resources for you that are listed there that can provide even additional assistance and information on continuing these conversations, and also information on trainings on race and racial justice too. So what's the vision? The vision, or what we ultimately want these conversations to achieve, is for organizations and teams to feel grounded and prepared to thoughtfully engage the African American community and organizations. Our vision is that the Collaborating for Justice report and this guide, they serve as encouragement to you and support on the urgency of having this conversation and of this engagement, right? So, you may be the only person from your team or your organization here today, and you may be thinking, man, it may be hard to get the rest of my team on board. So, which is exactly why we've created this guide, so that you have some more information and support and guidance on how to start these conversations. So we hope that this guide will also shed light and increase awareness of the needs that your agency may have for more information or even more training. And so additionally, the contents that's a part of them, we talked about the topic areas and what it covers, but what specifically is within those. First, we have facilitator guidelines. So we know that having these conversations, it's important to think about about the facilitation, how the conversation is structured. And so there's guidelines that are there for facilitators to follow. If you're the chair of your task force, and there's some guidelines for you to follow to help you. There's 4 distinct discussion prompts, which are understanding barriers that older African Americans face, deepening awareness of culturally specific organizations, challenges and concerns about engagements, and the next steps for engagement. Since conversations about inequities may raise feelings of indifference or guilt or shame or mistrust or fear. Sometimes people feel fear and maybe think they may say something wrong, or, these facilitator guidelines are offered, and the discussion prompts to ensure that, their conversations are meaningful and productive as possible. And understanding that all feelings that may come up are valid, and are expected. Um, but that shouldn't result in these conversations not happening, because the truth of the matter is we have a vulnerable population that's suffering more than needed. And so it's important that for the livelihood and safety of African American older adults, that more of these conversations amongst mainstream teams are happening. So we got to accept that those feelings are there, and we have to continue to be brave enough to have these conversations, and this guide should help you in doing so. So for part 3, I will turn things over to Kristen to continue.
All right, thanks, Victoria. So the third component of the Collaborating for Justice guide is the Community Forum Toolkit. So first, you really you understand the racial and cultural context. You've had conversations within your organization or your team about the importance of building these partnerships and what that could look like. The Community Forum Toolkit then is really designed to support your community in coming together to start to have conversations. So one of the listening sessions that we did in preparation of these materials was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we brought together a diverse group of people, from faith leaders to grassroots organizations to county human services, nonprofit domestic violence programs. And really one of the major themes from that session was that even among those working with the African American community closely every day, who are part of that community, they're really not everyone was aware of the efforts, the initiatives, the programs that were happening. And the group really talked a lot about the importance of having a space to come together as a first step to break down silos. In fact, this listening session, I think a lot of people felt like was almost a community forum toolkit, because they were able to really talk to and learn about work happening in their community that they didn't really otherwise know about. And it really brought to light this importance of really, as a first step, we need to know what's happening in our community before we know how we can collaborate on behalf of the African American community. So this was the inspiration for the Community Forum Toolkit. It really aims to bring together partners who work in and with the African American community to better understand what one another is doing, and then how they might support one another's work. So at a community forum, there's a facilitated networking conversation. People come together to share what they do and then learn about what else is happening in their community. And this is really intended to result in greater understanding of each partner's work supporting older African Americans. And then with this greater understanding can come clarity on opportunities to collaborate and strengthen one another's work. So how can the community forum toolkit help? I mean, ultimately, we wanted to make this as much of a grab and go resource for you so that you don't feel overwhelmed at the prospect of planning such a community event. So the toolkit will help you with planning and organization. It provides materials that you can adapt for your own use, and ultimately will help you to create this important space for relationship building. So what does it include? The toolkit includes a facilitator's guide for how to host a community forum. This guide includes a step-by-step instructions for what to do to organize the forum from, further in advance to right before, during, after. And then we included an agenda for the planning group. So one of the action items to prepare for a community forum is to first develop a planning group. So there's an agenda for that group for the day to guide them through kind of like an internal agenda process. There's also a sample agenda for the participants, an external agenda. It also includes a sample PowerPoint slide deck with notes that will guide you in holding the meeting, so that again, you're not going to take this PowerPoint template and just blankly use it, right? And there are even spots that you really have to adapt for your own, but it gives you a sense of what this could look like. And it gives you a starting point so that you're not starting from scratch. So who should attend a community forum? The invite list really should be wide ranging. We talked a lot about building a holistic network today. So think about community-based leaders, grassroots organizations, faith organizations, and older adults themselves. So consider not only those who work explicitly on elder justice issues, but those who work with the whole community. When you ask people to participate, a phone call is often better than an email. Find out what their interests are and who else they know who might be interested in coming to the community forum. This might include people not affiliated with an organization. Perhaps they're known as a leader in the community, but not currently formally working for an organization. So really, again, think really widely as you consider who to invite to the community forum.
Hello again, everyone. All right. So as we start to bring our webinar to a close, we just have a couple of discussion questions and a little bit more homework for you. And then we'd love to take your questions and take your comments as well. So first, and thinking about the components that we just shared, the conversation guide and the community forum toolkit, what would it look like for you to implement a conversation, a courageous conversation in your agency with your team? And what would it look like to have a community forum toolkit? What things would need to happen? How could you make that happen? What comes to mind as you think about that? So we'll give you a moment to think about it, and please share in the chat. But it's the type of thing, as you're thinking about it, that can take, we don't want, we provided these resources so that you can have a jump start, you can have a model, you can have some guidance on how to do it, because we don't want you to be stuck in analysis paralysis, but we want to make sure that you have, a guide that you can use that can be tailored for your community. So what would that look like for this to go well, to have this conversation? What would it feel like? think it seemed like before it took a minute for our responses to load. So there we go. Okay, I see Maya says a free centralized venue and a facilitator coordinator. Yes, absolutely, for the community forum. So if you can secure that. So yes, thinking about the logistics, having to have those pieces in place. And also, what would it, what would the feeling be for you to bring together the agencies and the members of your community to talk about this issue? See, Gail says need the support of the head of organizations. Absolutely, that helps a lot to bring people to the table. If you can get the head or the leadership of organizations as well, you can get their buy-in and their commitment. That makes a huge difference, definitely. Anyone else? Maureen says her organization has a DEI department that reaches out to culturally specific communities and organizations. She's planning to reach out to the director of the department and discuss with her. Awesome. It's a great next step. Alicia says we will need a diversity and inclusion leader. Sure. And I would encourage you to see if you can operate in that role to kind of get that started. To start the conversations. What would a diversity and inclusion leader do? That is there something that maybe you can talk about as a team until that person is in place to move things along? What conversations, can you have in your team, about that? But thank you as well for sharing. Anyone else? What do you think the impact would be? If you were able to do this, if you're able to have a conversation, you're able to have a conversation with your team in your community, what would the impact be? What do you see happening as a result? Okay, well, I want you to think about that question. I want you to think about it. And if you have any other ideas, please share. I see Gail says impact will be huge to bring people together. Exactly. That's what we want you to think about, the impact, and to be focused on that. Maureen says a relationship or partnership where we can better and effectively serve older adults based on their needs and wants. Yes. Staying focused, as I'm sure many of you know, on the goal and vision is normally the motivation that you need to keep moving forward when things get difficult. So thinking about what the impact would be, the impact it would make, the difference it would make, the value it would bring, the lives that could be saved and shared, and healing that would take place from starting these conversations. So thank you all for that. I want you to keep thinking about it as we move forward. See, one more. Oswaldo said more culturally sensitive and mindful services. Exactly. Exactly. Awesome. Okay. Oh, whoops. I skipped one. I skipped one. Okay. So we got a little additional homework. Oh, sorry about that, everyone. Come on, slide. All right. So a little additional homework. We ask you to set a time to discuss collaborating and partnering with culturally specific organizations within your agency. So start to use this guide. Start to use the conversation guide, with your team first, and to just have the conversations and document the takeaways and next steps, on what you want to do next to engage partnerships. Some of you started to share that. You can talk to the DEI leader where you work, or that's something that you need to get in place. So have these conversations, utilize these resources, and we want to encourage you to try to do that before we meet again in just a few weeks. So any questions or comments, anything else that you'd like to share, any questions that you have as we start to close out our time together? And I see Kristen added evaluation of today's webinar. Please take a moment to complete that. It really helps us as we plan webinars for you all. as well, and things we could do better or what's going well. So thanks in advance for completing that. So if you have any other additional questions, please feel free to add in the chat, and then we will. Oh, I see Kelly says, yes, where can we download the tasks? So I can put another link to the toolkit in the here in the chat, and that will have, if you mean, oh, that the link to the toolkit will have the task from the the guide itself. But also, if you mean, maybe if you mean the homework, I did send to each of you the PDF of today's PowerPoint, which has the homework questions in there. All right, and then trying to advance.
I moved it forward, Victoria.
Okay. I don't see, I'm so sorry, it's not moving on my screen.
Okay.
Okay, so the upcoming webinars we want to share with you. So we will meet again for our next webinar. We will meet again for our next webinar on Tuesday, April 16th. And that will be a conversation with culturally specific organization leaders. And we will have 3 leaders of culturally specific organizations that will join us. So we're really, really excited about that. We'll have some Q&A time, and then you'll have the opportunity to share more, to ask them questions, to hear directly from them. We've shared a lot of information in this presentation mode, but we wanted to have the opportunity to discuss and for you to hear directly from these leaders and their experiences. So we are very fortunate to have Mrs. Antonia Drew Norton from the Asha Project in Milwaukee, Mrs. Kalima Johnson from the Sasha Center in Detroit, Michigan, and Dr. Patricia Davenport from our house in Greenville, Mississippi. So we really look forward to having them next time. So I will post the link to the guide again. Okay. Kristen, I see there's a question about the question. Can you go back to that slide? Okay. And I just put the link for the guide back into the chat again. Okay. And so you see the homework question: set a time to discuss collaborating and partnering with culturally specific organizations within your agency, and also document any takeaways and next steps to engage in partnerships. So we'd love to hear a bit more about how it goes. What are you going to do next? And to utilize the resources. And so for our last couple of slides, you can stay connected to us at InCall with any additional questions. Next slide will have a QR code and just how to contact and reach us, our website. We can go to the next one. Yeah, so you'll see our socials and how to sign up for our newsletter, and also our website, which has a lot of resource information as well. You'll also find the Collaborating for Justice guide there, as well as Increasing Access Toolkit. And we just want to thank you once again for joining us today and for your attention. I apologize about my service going in and out, but hopefully that the information and all was helpful and good for you. So thank you so much. Kristen, any closing comments you have?
No, but thanks for attending, everybody, and we'll see you in a few weeks with our panel.
Yes, thanks so much.